Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Whitney Webb joins us today, and we talk about Whitney's three-part series titled Engineering Contagion, Amerithrax, Coronavirus, and the Rise of the Biotech Industrial Complex, which she and Raul Diego wrote during the last few months. Quoting from the first article of the series, quote, "This investigative series, titled Engineering Contagion, Amerithrax, Coronavirus, and the Rise of the Biotech Industrial Complex, will examine these disturbing parallels between the 2001 Anthrax attacks and the current scandals and quote-unquote solutions of the COVID-19 crisis, as well as the simulations that eerily preceded both events. By tracing key actors in dark winter from 2001 to the present, it is also possible to trace the corruption that has lurked behind the U.S. quote-unquote biodefense and pandemic preparedness efforts for decades, and which now is rearing its ugly head as pandemic panic distracts the American and global public from the fundamentally untrustworthy and frankly dangerous individuals who are in control of the U.S. government's and corporate America's response. Given their involvement in Dark Winter and more recently Event 201 and Crimson Contagion, this series seeks to explore the possibility that, just like the 2001 anthrax attacks, government insiders had foreknowledge of the COVID-19 crisis on a scale that thus far has gone unreported, and that those same insiders are now manipulating the government's response and public panic in order to reap record profits and gain unprecedented power for themselves and control over people's lives, unquote. Whitney Webb is a writer and researcher, soon to be author. She's made numerous radio, television, and video appearances on a variety of programs across the political spectrum. Her work aims to highlight underreported issues and find common ground between people of different political persuasions regarding corruption, government overreach, the lack of accountability for militaries and intelligence agencies, and the military-industrial complex. She publishes at The Last American Vagabond now, and on her website, Unlimited Hangout. And she's the host of a new podcast, also titled Unlimited Hangout. She was formerly a staff writer at Mint Press News. We recorded this on June 9th, 2020. Whitney Webb is here, speaking to us from Chile. Hello, Whitney, and thank you so much for coming back on the show. It's great to talk with you.
Hey, absolutely, anytime.
Yeah, so I just have to warn everybody in advance that these are extremely difficult circumstances that we're recording this under. I've got storm damage and a big excavator outside and tree workers. Whitney is dealing with internet issues and a new location, and trying to deal with family, and so she's recording this from her car. So this is probably not going to be the best audio, but hopefully that doesn't matter to people. Certainly doesn't to me. And she's also under extreme demand. So I just really appreciate the fact that she has made the time to do this interview. We're going to talk about a series that Whitney did. It's called Engineering Contagion. It has three parts. It'll be linked in the show notes for everyone to read. I would recommend, reading this and letting it sink in, and maybe reading it more than once if you really want to dig the details. I've even listened to one of them again, just to, because each time I get more out of it. And the first one talks about, the title is All Roads Lead to Dark Winter, which was one of these simulations, kind of similar to the Event 201 simulation prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And, there are some very curious parallels. And I think most striking is the companies and the people, the names that keep reemerging. And those details alone are very interesting. The whole biotech industry is very interesting, and the ties in with military and the different labs. And I out of all this, I don't look at let's say this is some type of a bio war going on. I don't think it's a good idea to look at it in terms of nation states or political parties, because as you'll notice, there are just ties that go way back, and the key figures, whether they're just responding to emergencies and they keep getting relied on over and over again. I don't know, maybe, or maybe not. So the second part, the is called A Killer Enterprise: How One of Pharma's Most Corrupt Companies Plan to Corner the COVID-19 Cure Market, which of course is the testing. There's a financial bonanza in any type of pandemic or a bioweapons attack like the Anthrax one was framed as. Not only the testing, there's treatment drugs, that's another whole line of business, and then the vaccines is a whole other line of business. The emergency response, the different equipment that maybe, how you had to take all your shoes off at the airport after 9/11, and they had these x-ray machines. People made money on all those things. And people are going to make money from this pandemic too. They already are, and they will going forward, most likely. The third one is Head of the Hydra: The Rise of Robert Kadlec. And we're not going to have enough time to go into every single detail, but there are some specific, very curious figures, Robert Kadlec being one of them, Jerome Howard being another. People who've dug into, the 9/11 story a lot will know that name. Some names you'll know, some names you won't. Woolsey keeps coming, his name keeps popping up again. And, he even popped up through Russiagate, so people who are familiar with that are familiar with him. Maybe they don't know that he had an involvement with the Anthrax situation too. But Whitney, let's just, well, I'm going to mainly just let you drive this, but let's kind of touch on something from each of these parts of the series. I thought the first one was particularly good because they were all good. I'm just telling you why the first one was particularly good. It was a very succinct and packed with information, sort of a recap of the whole anthrax situation, how that played out, the things that were going on in the 1990s. And in that, you draw some parallels to COVID-19, the comparisons that you saw, and the sort of the same actors. It's hard to believe that people involved in that could still even be around, be trusted with anything, but they are. So let's just lay the foundation a little bit, with a little bit from the Dark Winter situation and anthrax.
Right. So that first article, the reason it's worth explaining the reason it was written. By the way, this whole series I co-wrote with Raul Diego, who's at Mint Press News, by the way. But that first article has to do with the fact that a lot of these simulations that took place last year prior to coronavirus, it sort of came under the microscope in light of all that has transpired these past couple of months. Event 201 and Crimson Contagion, the people that led both of those exercises had been involved in this Dark Winter exercise. And Dark Winter was a simulation of a bioterror attack that had a lot of parallels to the 2001 anthrax attacks, which occurred several months after Dark Winter took place. Right. So I thought it was very interesting that, well, okay, so we have these pandemic simulations that were eerily predictive last year with these various groups, and they were involved in the same type of activity with the anthrax attacks. And what's interesting about the anthrax attacks is that, in my opinion, it didn't go as it was intended to go, because if you look at what the initial narrative was for the anthrax attacks, which was, by the way, put forth in Dark Winter months prior, it was to blame a foreign power, specifically Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and say that he was working hand in glove with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden, and that they had the capacity for to create, bioweapons and, unleash bioterrorist attacks, right? And that, of course, unraveled very quickly, and because it became abundantly clear that the anthrax used in the attack was the AIM strain, which is specific to the U.S. military. So, of course, it obviously became a domestic source, and at that point, news coverage and just general interest in who the attacker was died down precipitously when it could no longer be linked to Iraq. But major efforts continued well into, I think, like 2003 to claim that those attacks had been linked to those individuals. And what's interesting is that the FBI investigation into the anthrax attacks, Amerithrax, was the case name of that. It didn't officially close until I think like 2010. Several years, and they didn't really have anyone, and they ended up pinning it on this guy named Bruce Ivins. And their efforts to Ivins, by the way, had worked at Fort Detrick, and they had a very flimsy case against him. But Ivins ended up dying allegedly of a suicide, even though he was under 24/7 FBI surveillance at the time, right before that case was going to go to trial. But of course, it didn't go to trial, so they just closed the case and said that was the matter. But the National Academy of Sciences just demolished the FBI's whole case against Ivins. The former lead investigator, who had quit in 2006 because of efforts to what he said essentially was framing Ivins and all of that, said that evidence had been stovepiped to make Ivins look guilty, and that there was a mountain of evidence exonerating Ivins that the FBI had intentionally withheld. So what all of this means essentially is that the person that actually did those attacks, we don't really know who it was. But if you actually look, I think I got pretty close to who it likely was, which for those that are interested, could read the third installment of the series that came out a few weeks ago. But what's interesting about Dark Winter, right, is that a lot of the narratives for what was going for what transpired with the anthrax attacks, including the mode of the attack. For example, anthrax being in letters sent to the press, right? Things like that. The alleged involvement of Iraq and Saddam Hussein, and all of these things,
and to politicians and just to make sure I put this in, and to politicians who were not quickly approving the Patriot Act.
Well, right. That was the anthrax attacks themselves. I was talking about Dark Winter, which was
in sorry.
2001. Yeah, but that's true. So when the anthrax attacks did happen, you had members of the press receive them, including people that had attended Dark Winter, like Judith Miller, who was very close to several Bush administration officials. She received a fake anthrax letter. Conveniently for her, it was entirely inert and not deadly. And some other people, and the senators specifically that received it, Tom Daschle, and I think Patrick Leahy was the other one, and Russ Feingold's office also. They were involved in. They were opposed to, not necessarily not all of them were like opposed to the Patriot Act, but they were opposed to having it rammed through with little to no debate.
Yeah,
which is what the Bush administration wanted. And then, of course, all of these events transpire, and it is rammed through. And it's also worth pointing out, because a lot of people don't really remember the anthrax attacks as much as they may remember, 9/11, right? But it really served to drum up the case for war in a way that 9/11 alone could not have. And what's interesting also, and important to point out, is that some participants at Dark Winter, specifically Jerome Hauer, had what I would argue is foreknowledge that something was going to happen with anthrax beginning on the day of 9/11, because he told people in the Bush administration, specifically Dick Cheney's office, to start taking ciprofloxacin, which is an antibiotic that prevents anthrax infection, and that members of the Bush administration from that day on, we don't know exactly how long they were on it, because that's never been made public, but we know they were taking it as a preventative measure for anthrax attacks beginning on 9/11. And around that same time, Dick Cheney was personally briefed about Dark Winter by the authors of that exercise, which included the moderator for Event 201. That took place last year, Thomas Inglesby, and his former boss, Tara O'Toole, who now works with NQTEL at the CIA.
Yeah.
And, some of these other people, like Randall Larson, who is a very close, longtime associate of Robert Kadlec, who's now leading HHS's coronavirus response, and is also, a Dark Winter participant, I guess you could say. So it's all really the same group of people that were very involved in, things that were going on in the 2001 anthrax attacks, including the investigation, or rather since it really was an investigation, it was more of a cover-up, right? So like a lot of these people also had some role in the quote-unquote investigation, or advising it in some way, including Kadlec, and a couple of these other guys. But it's just it's very important to examine the history, because a lot of what happened post-anthrax attacks in terms of who benefited, specifically what vaccine companies benefited, it's a very similar situation to what's playing out now with coronavirus in a lot of big ways.
Yeah, and the fact that Robert Mueller seems to have been called into in the emergency situation to try to get the FBI investigation out of trouble, or I don't know what, but and he was called in when Russiagate kind of flopped and people were in a lot of big trouble. I mean, it's very curious. Let's put it that way. We can't prove anything else, and then in the second part, you get into some of going back into the 90s, and actually even before that, but mainly in the 90s, how there were companies who sort of had a monopoly on an anthrax vaccine. There were plans to vaccinate the entire U.S. military. It wouldn't surprise me if that would have expanded to like NATO, because there's a British element to all this too. Surprise, surprise. And the companies that are still in another form, still around, and now involved in the COVID thing again. So more parallels. And I guess, this is a complex. This is a public-private, complex. I can't think of a better word. So I guess it's not completely surprising that some of the same people, let's say there aren't that many experts in the world, but, some of them have failed spectacularly and they're still around too, which is always curious. So there are lots of names of companies and people and evolutions of those companies and acronyms, because there's government, of course, involvement as well. So let's just, let's skim that. Let's pick out the important parts of that second part, because I want to leave a lot of time for that third one.
Okay, so in A Killer Enterprise, the focus of that article is a company that is now known as Emergent Biosolutions, and I would recommend anyone listening to go and just do a cursory search for their, the name of that company and coronavirus vaccines or treatments, and you will see that they have received a considerable amount of funding, specifically government funding, for the development of various quote-unquote cures for coronavirus, among other things. Currently today, before coronavirus, Emergent Biosolutions also has the monopoly on the smallpox vaccine, the anthrax vaccine, and something that is called Narcan, which has a big role in the opioid epidemic in the United States. So it's important to, with that being said, it's important to look into how this company started and what they've done in the past, because that very much I would argue it informs one's opinion about what their quote unquote cures for coronavirus are likely to be of a similar flavor, let's say. So this company originally was known as Bioport. It was created out of a privatized aspect of Porton Down, which is the UK biodefense or bioweapons, side. And
famous in the Salisbury tax, by the way. Anyway.
Right. So the Bioport was a U.S. subsidiary of this company called Porton International, and that was related to Porton Down, right? And it was specifically created with the purpose of becoming the vehicle that would have a monopoly over the anthrax vaccine, because prior to this, the only licensed factory for producing anthrax vaccine in the United States was in Lansing, Michigan, and it was state-owned. And around this time, it was privatized and sort of auctioned off, right? And so this company was created and came in and swooped it up. And this was done by a group of, a father and son team. who were German Lebanese businessmen, also involved in the UK, the El Hebri family, alongside a friend of theirs who was Joint Chiefs of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Reagan, William Crow, who obviously had long-standing ties to the Pentagon. Right. So this company was created, and they inherited this factory, they came into ownership of this factory, and at the time they did so, the factory had been shut down by the FDA because it had numerous problems with quality control, meaning that bad batches essentially of this vaccine had been produced, but no one really knows how long those problems had been there, right? And because of how controversial the anthrax vaccine was with the people that received it in the armed forces, it's essentially a given, really, that a lot of these, bad batches, so to speak, were administered to servicemen during this period of time when they were attempting to make all members of the U.S. military take the anthrax vaccine to prevent attacks with, biological terror attacks using anthrax, which had not happened up until that point. But that's a separate issue that we'll get into when we talk about the third part, where all of that came from, right? But anyway, the Pentagon, as soon as Bioport took over this factory, they essentially, the Pentagon awarded them a contract for anthrax vaccine that the factory couldn't produce because it had lost its license. So the Pentagon also gave Bioport money to pour into renovations. And several months after, Pentagon auditors come and they see that none of the money has gone to renovations, and the factory is still not, functioning, but a lot of the money instead went to senior management bonuses or redecorating offices, or just simply disappeared. No one knows where it goes. So, the Pentagon is in this awkward position, and they essentially bailed him out a second time. And this goes on for a while, the same pattern of them essentially just like fleecing down the Pentagon and not reopening the factory, but having this contract anyway. It continues to go on for a while up until August 2001, at which point Bioport is, basically being told by Congress and the Pentagon, even in public, that they're, going to be let go this time.
They're done,
and
right?
Of course, right, and of course, the anthrax attacks that would follow about a month later prevented that, because instead of them actually having to get the factory up to speed, people were so desperate for anthrax vaccine that they essentially just, relicensed the factory and really rammed it through. And, it wasn't a normal situation. It was expedited because of the urgency, right? And, well, it's even more of a miracle. It's not just that they got the factory relicensed and all their problems seemed to disappear, but also there were pushes to make anthrax vaccine mandatory, not just for members of the military, but for the police, for firefighters, for mailroom workers. So, definitely a big expansion of, their market, so to speak. And what's interesting, and this sort of dovetails with stuff I talk about in part 3, but a year before that, Bioport had gotten involved with some very shady CIA and Pentagon-linked anthrax experiments that were being run by Battelle Memorial Institute, which is this private organization that runs a lot of the national labs in the U.S. today, and is also a contractor for the Pentagon and the CIA. And it's just very interesting, the timing of all of that, when you consider that, for example, a lot of those people involved with those types of activities were also present at Dark Winter. You have, representations of the FBI, former CIA directors, and all of that stuff. And then these people like Jerome Hauer that are very involved in that world as well. It's just very disconcerting. But anyway.
Yeah, and over these past 20 years or so, just the privatization and these sort of public-private partnerships, and even if they're not official partnerships, like you said, they're filled with people who used to be government or still are, or are going back and forth in. There you have to keep in mind that there's been an explosion in not just in the biotech and bioweapons business, but in intelligence and in military. Just a lot of that money that used to go to that was more concentrated or was by state-owned entities is now being spread around, and a lot more people have a reason to want to profit from things, if just put it that way.
Right, absolutely. And what's worth pointing out is that one of the individuals that helped get this factory relicensed for Bioport was Jerome Hauer. Because on 9/11, well, the day of 9/11, Jerome Hauer was many things, right? We can get into that a little bit if you want,
Yes.
but
And he had an office in World Trade Center 7, and he was, yeah.
well, yeah, yeah, yeah. So he had previously been head of the Office of Emergency Management of New York City and was responsible for having that office placed in Building 7. But at the time, he was not serving in that capacity. Instead, he was head of Kroll Inc., or so, not head,
Oh, of
managing
course, the
director of
security
Kroll Inc.
situation.
So he was running security for Kroll for the World Trade Center. And he was not at his, desk that morning, obviously. So, anyway, one of the other hats he was wearing at that time, though, was that he was National Security Advisor to HHS Secretary at the time, Tommy Thompson. And so he gave Tommy Thompson the personal tour of 9/11 and also started advising him about things. And then another Dark Winter guy, Robert Kadlec, gets added to the Pentagon and is advising Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld about, bioterrorism and, anthrax and all of this stuff, right?
Mm.
But Hauer's interesting because he's one of the forces at HHS that is really behind this push to get Bioport relicensed. And then he, at that same time, ends up pushing for the creation of this post that was, it doesn't exist anymore because it's morphed and become other things. Robert Kadlec currently holds its successor office, by the way, but I think it was the Office of Public Health Preparedness, or OPHP, and that is what Hauer was placed into beginning in January 2002, and that's where a lot of this what we're seeing now with coronavirus and all the HHS throwing all this money at all of these big companies without knowing what they're really going to get in return, and all of this stuff, all of that goes back to this. It starts back here with Hauer and these people. But anyway, so Hauer's in that position from the beginning of 2002, and then he leaves in 2004, and immediately after leaving, he is added to Bioport's board of directors, and Bioport reforms, and at that point in 2004 becomes Emergent Biosolutions.
Hmm.
Some of the people they also end up adding to their board are former people that worked at the Pentagon that testified previously in favor of Bioport and claimed that their anthrax vaccine was safe, when in fact it has no safety track record at all. And the safety studies they submitted were not for their anthrax vaccine, but for a separate anthrax vaccine that was manufactured by Merck in like the 1960s or something
Jeez.
like that.
God.
So literally no safety track record at all. And for years, the anthrax vaccine has been one of the leading suspects in what is often referred to today as Gulf War syndrome, as having been responsible for that. Because, as I said earlier, there was this issue of bad batches and all of this stuff the factory was shut down over. And a lot of the batches that were produced before it was shut down ended up being injected into these people, and that took place before Bioport existed, at the beginning, in the first Gulf War, but also before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and prior to then as well. And actually, it was shown in court, and the government actually lost this case, that the military was injecting this anthrax vaccine into soldiers as an experimental off-label use because it wasn't even licensed to be used to prevent cases of inhalation anthrax. It was, for cutaneous anthrax, I believe, or something like that. A different type of anthrax exposure that military people in the event of a bioterror attack would not have been exposed to. So it wasn't even licensed to have the effect that it was allegedly justified for. So essentially, when you take a look at all of this together, basically what Bioport was doing is that it was a revolving door, in a sense, of a lot of these top people at the Pentagon or at HHS and other people in government, basically making a ton of money while using people in the military as guinea pigs, while at the same time they're also ginning up the quote unquote bioterror threat, when in fact that terror threat did not exist at all. Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, and the anthrax used in the 2001 anthrax attacks was a U.S. domestic source, right? So essentially,
Yes.
it's a giant racket, while at the same time it's using, people in the military as guinea pigs. But keep that cash coming in. Doesn't matter what happens to them, I guess. It's just honestly sickening. And when you consider that this is a company that is winning big time in light of coronavirus and all of that stuff, and you have people like Jerome Hauer still on their board of directors making a ton of money off of this, it just shows you that this scam has been going on for years and is worse, honestly worse than ever. Because
can you mention Rumsfeld and Cheney? And this is a good time to mention them, I think. What their what their role was at that point in time?
In what you mean in 2001 in
With the
particular?
anthrax vaccine and the
Oh,
things they were working
right.
on in the 90s. Yeah.
Right. Well, so Rumsfeld, before he was, Secretary of Defense the second time under George W. Bush, he was a executive of pharmaceutical firms, specifically J.D. Searle and Co., which was later sold off and given to Monsanto. But then right before he was part of the Bush administration, he was the top executive at Gilead.
Yeah.
Which
You don't
is
have to
a
go through into
pharmaceutical
detail.
company.
Just I
Oh,
think
okay.
it's just a good time to touch on that, to
Right.
bring
Well,
it
he
in
was
as to some
right.
of the names
Okay.
that were, yeah.
So Rumsfeld, of course, then very connected to the pharmaceutical industry by virtue of his time in the private sector, and then of course he becomes Secretary of Defense and is one of the people that helped save Bioport's vaccine contract, and is a proponent of expanding that and expanding quote unquote biodefense and all of these things, while simultaneously looking to justify an invasion of Iraq. This was in 2001, right? Justify an invasion of Iraq based on weapons of mass destruction, specifically trying to link him to anthrax. This is from a document that Rumsfeld wrote, and it's been released now. But I think it's from October, November 2001. It's talking about how to instigate conflict with Iraq, and a lot of it revolves around weapons of mass destruction, claiming Saddam Hussein has biological weapons, and linking Saddam Hussein to the anthrax attacks.
Yeah.
And a lot of the sources for those inflammatory and completely wrong media reports, like that ABC News media report saying that there was bentonite in the anthrax and that must have been Iraq, that came straight from the Department of Defense.
Yeah.
That
Sorry, I didn't
information.
mean to take you off track there. I just wanted to make sure we got that mention in there.
Right. And then Cheney on the other side, since you brought him up too, of course, he was vice president at the time. He was very interested in Dark Winter. Scooter Libby specifically turned him on to that exercise, and he was personally briefed by the people that wrote that exercise, who I mentioned earlier, and his office began taking Cipro, right after 9/11 on a tip from Jerome Hauer.
Yeah.
So.
So who is Emergent Biosolutions right now, and what are they? Well, I might be digging a little bit too into part 3.
Well, no. I touched on what they do now a little bit. So they're involved in several coronavirus cures, but I didn't talk about those cures specifically. And they also have a monopoly on Narcan, which is the one of the few. It's really the only. It's like a nasal spray, and it's the only one widely available that reverses an opioid overdose.
Yeah,
Right. So
police have
obviously,
it, and
right.
first
And they're
responders
mandated
have
to
it.
have it. And so, of course, that that policy was put in place after Emergent Biosolutions acquires Narcan, and has a monopoly over it and a lot of these other things. And of course, it helps their bottom line. The more overdoses there are, the more Narcan needs to be stocked by all of these, by regular people, by clinics, by first responders, by policemen, and all of this stuff. And if you actually listen to their top executives talk about Narcan, they say things like, colleges and U.S. high schools are untapped markets for Narcan and all of this stuff. Just very sick, personally.
Yeah.
Um, is my take on that. But anyway, what they're doing now, so they're involved in several joint vaccine development, vaccine candidates for coronavirus, I think including one with Novavax, and there's a few other ones as well. They're also involved in developing plasma blood treatments, or that are involved, like the blood plasma from people that have recovered from coronavirus and things like that. And have gotten, a considerable amount of funding from the government, specifically BARDA, which is part of HHS, and something that was tacked onto that office Jerome Hauer helped create back in 2002 and all of that. That basically what BARDA is that it's like a it's like like a teller window essentially for like big pharma, and they like come up and they get their
No.
cash and they go, and then like sometimes they take that product that they were paid to research and create to market, and sometimes they don't, and they stay with the money, right?
Yeah,
It
and
it is
the
just
the
insane.
pharmaceutical industry too. Like just a little anecdote. I'm not sure when it was. It was probably in the vicinity of 2010 or 2013. I was at an event. It was, like a seminar kind of thing, and they bring different scientists in. They bring in CEOs, and in this case, it was a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, and he was, talking to people in the business, and he was saying things like, we have a real problem. We don't have anything in the pipeline. So the pharmaceutical industry right now, they've taken existing drugs and they create longer lasting, time released versions of them and things like that. But there was sort of a bit of a panic and a dry spot in the pharmaceutical industry. So I don't know, maybe they would be more eager to get into things that are, uh, it's just been a tough time. It's particularly in this area where I live in. There are a lot of pharmaceutical industries. There are a lot of people in the industry out of work, and it's a tough time for the pharmaceutical industry, or it was. So, that's just a factor.
Well, for workers like that, it's been difficult, right? But
Yeah,
for people that own lots of stock in pharmaceutical companies or top executives, it's been great for them. And this has been true not just for coronavirus, but for previous pandemics. A good example being the bird flu scare, which of course was really hyped up by the head of HHS at the time. It wasn't Tommy Thompson, it was his successor, and I am totally blanking on his name, so sorry about that.
okay.
But he said that 2 million Americans could die of bird flu on national TV and all this stuff. And there was this decision made to stockpile a particular drug to treat it. And that drug had Gilead had a monopoly of that. And that, of course, was the company that Donald Rumsfeld had run prior to joining the Bush administration. And so he was in the Bush administration at that time and ended up making a killing because he still owned large amounts of stock in Gilead. Right.
He's been
So all
awfully
their
quiet
campaigning.
lately. Is he still? Uh, do we know anything? Is he still involved with that company?
He probably still owns stock in it, but I mean, he is a bit older, so I'm sure he just takes a back seat
Yeah,
a
yeah.
little more than he used to, right?
Thank God for that.
But right. So, it's very possible though, but because we've also seen some other Gilead drugs with coronavirus, like oh, I forget how to pronounce it. It's begins with REM,
Yeah, Remsdevir or something.
yeah. Right. So they have
Remesdevir.
a monopoly on that as well, and that was getting some play. And every time, someone, one of these companies that makes some announcement about its vaccine advancing or makes there's some quote unquote promising result about this or that, the stocks of those companies, if they have a monopoly on that particular treatment, it just skyrockets,
Yeah, that just
even if it goes
happened.
down. Right. And it happened with Moderna, which is a strategic ally of DARPA, which is the research arm of the Pentagon, right? So it's tied into government. It's gotten a lot of money funding from HHS and also from private organizations, a lot of which are backed by Bill Gates, or has also gotten money from the Gates Foundation itself. And they basically had this press release saying they had promising results from the study that had like a sample size of 8 and really ended up meaning nothing if you actually read about it, right? And it was just, but their stock exploded that day and for a couple of days, and then it went back down. But by then, a lot of people at the top at Moderna themselves, like some of their top executives had sold
Yeah.
several stocks that had peaked, and then it goes down, and they're like, well, we already sold ours. So, I mean, a lot of the
Yeah.
people at the top, not just in the pharmaceutical industry, have been doing that type of stuff a lot this year, and that is why the 1% and the billionaires and all of that have seen their net worth just explode, because essentially what has been going on has just been this massive transfer of wealth. And the pharmaceutical side, the profiteering of that is just one aspect of that, but it's really all encompassing. When you look at the so-called quote unquote bailout and how it was given to BlackRock to manage that, and all this stuff. I mean, it's essentially corporate looting on a massive scale, but the pharmaceutical one is particularly interesting, given that we're told anyway that these are going to be the things that they're producing that will allow us to return to quote unquote normal, right?
Right. And there's Instagram now has a lot, like a YouTube of its own. It has a live TV thing, and there's RFK. I'm not quite sure what his deal is on everything, but he has been keeping an eye on this pump and dump. He calls it a pump and dump operation, where while things are still uncertain, advance news of which company might have the vaccine and all this stuff. He noticed in real time that was it Moderna, that their actual executives were dumping stock while the positive news was being pumped, and the stock price was going up. But
Yeah, I believe that was Moderna, if I'm not mistaken, but I'd have to
yeah,
double check. But yeah.
so it's
I mean, that
interesting
that's
to
how this
check in.
operates. Yeah. It's all
Yeah,
it's a scam essentially. I mean, going back to like the Bioport example, I mean, they took over this factory that they knew was shut down. They had clearly no intentions of actually fixing it. And, this the Anthrax attacks happened, and then they don't really fix it, but it gets relicensed anyway, right? And
yeah.
while
So
they're
the
making all
assets are
this
like
money
worth
the whole time.
nothing,
Right.
and they can get swept up for fire sale. And yeah, so there are people who are very good at that kind of thing. Not only like the core business, but the peripheral, stock prices, and there seems to be like a number of different angles, and every one of them's being worked. But yeah, to our disadvantage, and on a scale that is like way exponentially higher than the 2008 crash, by the way. I've heard some people saying. So,
Hmm.
yeah. Anyway, so I think you covered a good bit of that, enough anyway to get into part 3 here. And this is the one I know the least, Whitney. So this is part 3. It's called Head of the Hydra: The Rise of Robert Kadlec. And I should mention that Whitney did a long interview with Robbie Martin on this. So if you hear things you're interested in on this one, it's a deeper dive. You can go into that and listen to more of it. I would recommend that.
Right. Well, I also started a podcast, but I only have one episode out
Oh
so
my
far.
gosh, yes, I'm
Things have been
sorry, I
really
forgot
crazy.
about
No,
that.
no, no, it's fine. But I only bring it up because Robbie and I on that first episode we talk about Dark Winter, the first article of this series, very in depth there. So if people, like you were saying, are interested, I would recommend looking at that. The podcast is called Unlimited Hangout. You can find episode 1 about Dark Winter, and of course on Media Roots Radio, Robbie's podcast. I talk about Robert Kadlec, and of course when I did that interview with Robbie, it was right after I'd finished writing it. It's been a couple of weeks, so
Yeah,
my
so there's
recall may have
actually
been a little better with Robbie, but I can still do a pretty good job, I'm sure.
well, I think this will be good because you'll get like a summary level here, and then if you want to, you've got 2 places to go dig more into it, and they're both excellent. And I did listen to both, so I should have remembered that there were 2. Anyway, so let's talk about part 3, the Head of the Hydra article. You've got another one too. I mean, there are some other ones that are not part of a series too that I'll make sure that I get that information from Whitney, and that talk about the complex, the
Right.
I don't even know
Well,
what you call it, biotech complex. But
right. So, what's worth pointing out though is that this series, it's 3 parts right now, but I think we wanted to do a little more on it, but it's probably just going to end up being a book at
Yeah,
some
I
point.
can see. I
Right,
can
my
see why.
Epstein book. Yeah, because it actually goes long before Bioport, right? And there's actually a lot of crazy ties that go way, 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 way back to where the whole idea of this type of scam originated and where it originated and all of that. It's all very interesting. So it's definitely going to require a book. And also I wanted to explore some of the people that I just briefly mentioned earlier, including the people that run the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security that was involved in Event 201, is currently run by Thomas Inglesby, who helped write Dark Winter and all of that.
And
But
very
I
involved now. Yeah.
Yes, and very involved what's going on now. But he is the successor to Tara O'Toole, Inglesby and O'Toole have just been together working side by side for decades and decades and decades. And just a few years ago, she joined, the CIA for In-Q-Tel, and now he is in charge of the Center for Health Security that O'Toole had led previously, right? And they are a very interesting bunch and are very involved with a lot of the same people, but from a different angle, right? Mainly the academia, science side of things.
Yeah, that's the
And
scariest part for me, being in science and engineering. That to me, that just scares the hell out of me. Anyway,
yeah,
sorry.
well, what's interesting is that really, really quick before we get into Robert Kadlec, and we're on this point, O'Toole is actually one of the people that really. Why she's been at In-Q-Tel has been really heavily promoting contact tracing and surveillance and all of this stuff for quote unquote healthcare purposes and for pandemic preparedness and all of that, in several papers going back to I think like 2017 or something like that. And now all of that is advancing very quickly with plenty of help from In-Q-Tel, not just O'Toole, but other people there, right?
Can I just
So,
mention one other thing here too?
mhm.
Another thing that is advancing contact tracing is the protests. Some of the police departments are using contact tracing to track some of the quote unquote
They are?
looters. Oh, they are, yeah. So here's another terrifying situation that's going to justify, as if one terrifying pandemic wasn't scary enough. Now they're saying, oh, we'll use contact tracing to trace some of those looters and we'll track them down.
Right. Well,
So
I
you've
would
got,
argue that this was always the plan. The plan
mm,
was always to use contact tracing for these things, and that what was done is that this was sold to the public in the time of the pandemic as a way to manufacture consent for that policy, and
yeah,
to justify its implementation.
I
Because
agree.
even last year, that same sort of push for surveillance and not with the term contact tracing, but something very similar was being done, being promoted as a way to quote unquote stop mass shootings before they happen, right? A sort of pre-crime thing, and this was being really promoted really heavily by people in the White House, people close to Trump. Including his former boss at NBC Universal, and his daughter Ivanka, and then people at the Department of Justice and in the private sector as well, Palantir, Google, people like that, very involved in pushing for that same type of policy.
Surveillance,
But
yeah,
at the
policy.
time, the justification that they were trying to sell people on was, oh, we have to stop mass shootings. There can't be any more mass shootings. And of course, this was after a spate of mass shootings last year, right? And that ended up not working. And so, the pandemic's here, and that seems to have worked. And now they're just going to go about using it the way they always you know had always wanted.
And
It's really that whole.
they're getting civilians involved too by hiring the states, I think, and maybe even lower levels are hiring people as contact tracers to actually, I guess, look at the data and I don't know, talk to the people who were exposed to COVID-19. So, I don't know whether that's really needed or whether it's just another way of,
I
like you
don't
said,
think it's needed,
manufacturing
but
consent.
it's actually something that has been going on under different guises previously, specifically during wartime in the United States. For example, in World War One, there was an organization called the American Protective League that was basically citizen vigilantism that was tacitly approved of by the Woodrow Wilson administration of the time, to basically go around and harass people that did not support the war, or German immigrants, or people like that, and they, harassed people and made all these arrests and all this stuff, and they were like, semi-deputized citizens going around and, doing this. If you see something, say something,
To a
type
new
of
level, yeah.
Right, but this was at the beginning of the 20th century. This was during World War I, and so that's a lot of that same stuff that went on in World War I, is popping up again now. And I think it's no coincidence either that a lot of the legislative basis for like the attacks on the press right now, or WikiLeaks, or whistleblowers, that all came from World War I as well, right? The Sedition Act, the Espionage Act,
Right,
right?
that's true.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we're seeing a ramp up in those efforts in recent time. And of course, with the pandemic, it's going into overdrive as well, because of the fight against so-called, misinformation.
And I'll
And
just
things of that
mention that we're
nature.
going to do we're gonna do a sort of high level bonus question with Whitney after this interview, and it'll be available to patrons on just some of the higher level conclusions we think we see or we think we can draw from this, just to tease that a little bit here. But back to the part three.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I just wanted
No,
to get
no,
some
it's
um,
amazing that we made this
out
much
there.
progress in the amount of time we have. So
Right. So part 3 is about a man named Robert Kadlec. Robert Kadlec is currently the HHS's Assistant Secretary of Preparedness and Response, which is the successor agency to that one I mentioned earlier that Jerome Hauer helped create. But actually, Robert Kadlec was also involved in the creation of that office that Hauer held in early 2002. And he was also very involved in the legislation that ended up essentially shaping the office he now holds for like over 2 decades, right? So he was one of those guys that was very behind the scenes, not a public face, but now at this very crucial point in time for everything that's going on right now, he is in that position, right? Which I think is very interesting. But Robert Kadlec as an individual, in terms of his career history, I would argue is deeply disconcerting for a number of reasons, not just because of him himself, but also because of the people with whom he was closely associated. People like a guy I mentioned earlier who co-wrote Dark Winter, Randall Larson, another man named William C. Patrick III, who is honestly one of the most overlooked and just disturbing individuals that I've ever had the displeasure of researching and investigating. And given all the digging I had to do into the Anthrax case, I think he was most likely one of intimately involved in what in those attacks himself.
and those names are largely unknown to anybody. I'd never heard of the three of
Right.
them before. Right. Yeah.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that right after the Anthrax attacks, William Patrick, who had a lot of connections to the government, he gets added to the group of the FBI's technical advisors for the Anthrax case.
Oh, how convenient that is. And he had to
How
like,
very convenient for him. And actually, his protege was a man named Stephen Hatfill, who was the top suspect in the anthrax attacks for years before they pinned it on Ivans instead. And actually, the lead investigator of the Amerithrax investigation, Richard Lambert, that ended up resigning, he was one of the ones that was insistent that Hatfill knew something,
well,
right?
let me just mention here too. I don't know if you noticed this, but uh, what's their name? Justice Watch, Tom Fitton, that organization, little think tank or whatever they are. They run
Oh,
a lot of
yeah, I can't remember the name right now, but I know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
they do a lot of FOIA reports. They get a lot of documents released, and they were actually pretty good
Judicial
on
Watch.
Judicial Watch. Sorry, yeah, and they actually had, they did some pretty good work on RussiaGate. So I happened to see one of his Tom Fitton's live streams, and who was on that but Stephen Hatfill talking about COVID-19. I was like,
Stephen
oh,
Hatfield was also on Steve Bannon's Pandemic War Room
oh,
as well. So it's very interesting to see that individual being trotted out, because a lot of other people, for example, that were involved in that whole saga, like James Woolsey, who you mentioned a little bit
yeah,
earlier, who was a Dark Winter participant, former CIA director, PNAC member, and all of that, he's been very involved in what is called the Committee on the Present Danger China, which is a group that's had several incarnations, is currently focused around China. Steve Bannon's very involved with that, and you have a lot of the same PNAT guys. And actually, the incarnation of Committee on the Present Danger before this one about China was about the War on Terror, and Jerome Hauer was part of that, and a lot of these other guys that are part of that now were part of that one as well. So all very convenient. But anyway, Robert Kadlec, right? So Robert Kadlec starts off his career, really. He's an Air Force physician by training. He was a special advisor to Special Operations Command right before the Gulf War, and was involved in the decision to have troops inoculated with the anthrax vaccine, because Kadlec, and along with William Patrick, determined that there was a high risk of anthrax attack. That's actually not the case based on the evidence that they had, but it's very dubious. But that's what they said, and that's what happened. And as I mentioned earlier, Gulf War syndrome, there's studies that have linked that specific vaccine to that specific syndrome, right? So Kadlec and Patrick and a lot of the other guys in this orbit were, just saying constantly that there was Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and all of this stuff. Of course, after the Gulf War, Kadlec and Patrick go as weapons inspectors to Iraq. They find nothing. Kadlec goes again in 1996. He goes again in 1998. He still finds nothing. And even after the 2003 invasion, he goes back twice more after that, still finds nothing, but still maintains to this day that it was there. But he even admits now that actual evidence has been elusive and things like that. But despite the fact that these people aren't working at all on concrete evidence, Kadlec was teaching at the National War College, and during that period of time was just producing all of these hypothetical doomsday scenarios about bioterror attacks, specifically anthrax, but also like economic terrorism with focuses on countries like China, attacking the U.S. economically with bioterrorism and all of this stuff back in the 90s. And as I mentioned earlier, he was very close with Randy Larson, and they had taught together at National War College. So did William Patrick. They were all there. Beginning in 2001, Randy Larson and Robert Kadlec are going to be teaching a course on Homeland Security that's going to begin on the day of 9/11. Of course, that doesn't happen because of those attacks. So Kadlec ends up, as I said earlier, joining the Pentagon, advising Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld on biodefense, right when all this stuff with anthrax is going on, and it is being sourced from some sort of U.S. military lab during that period of time. All very interesting. But what's interesting too is that Randy Larson, right before this and before Dark Winter, where Kadlec and Larson were both involved, was tasked to lead this group called ANSWER. The Answers, ANSER, which is like a think tank spinoff of Rand Corporation, then headed by Ruth David, who was a big CIA science officer for a very long time. Randy Larson is chosen to head their Institute of Homeland Security Studies, that it was, one of the sponsors of Dark Winter, while all of this was going on, right? So Robert Kadlec, then, after the anthrax attacks, once they actually end up happening, he also becomes involved in the investigation. He's there when this claim about bentonite is made, and he is tasked with following up on that. But unfortunately, he tries to bring in the scientist into that. Well, unfortunately for him, right, or for these people rather, he tries to bring the scientist into the investigation, who actually has some integrity and says there's no bentonite in it, because it's true, no bentonite was ever found in the anthrax, right? And things of that nature. So it ends up not firming up the way they had hoped. But of course, this some claim that was made by some guy in a meeting with no factual evidence about bentonite, something that may look like bentonite being in the anthrax, that was at this meeting where Kadlec and Wolfowitz and these people were. And of course, that Brian Ross ABC News story claiming there was bentonite in the anthrax sites, 4 top officials, so there were only so many people at that meeting, you know what I mean? So It's all very convenient. Anyway, not long after that, Kadlec becomes added to the Homeland Security Council and is advising Bush and Cheney directly on issues of biodefense, bioterror, and all of that, and then ends up shaping the entire policy that's brought us to today, right? That aspects of that policy, at least as it relates to groups like Emergent Biosolutions and Bioport, and all of that. How that's played out. Kadlec's been very instrumental on that. And now this is the guy that's, directly in charge of HHS's entire coronavirus response. He's the guy.
How did he get in that position?
He was nominated by Trump in 2017.
Yeah.
Prior to that, he was very closely associated and worked very closely with Senator Richard Burr, who was insider trading with coronavirus relatively recently and had to resign from the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's also, Kadlec also co-founded a company with Fuad Al-Hibri, who's the guy that created Bioport, Emergent Biosolutions, and has a lot of ties to people like DARPA and the NSA through his consulting work that when he was not in government. So he's definitely deeply tied in with those spheres, I guess you could say. And last year he did this simulation called Crimson Contagion. That was actually not one simulation, it was 4, and they took place between January and August of last year. And a lot of really interesting things were discussed there, including continuity of government. For people who are familiar with that term, that should probably be a red flag. But also, it involved like the Secretary of the Treasury, what they would do in the event of a pandemic and all of this stuff. It had the participation of 19 different federal agencies, 12 states, a bunch of private sector companies, including companies that are making some of this contact tracing software now, and things like that, all very convenient, I guess.
So even more interesting than Event 201, maybe.
Yeah, and it's definitely gotten less coverage. No one's
for sure
bothered to look into it, which I think is telling.
Yeah, I'm going to dig into that one a little more, because Event 201, I mean, I've heard a lot of people talking about that one. Okay, well, Whitney, we're kind of out of time here, and you've brought us up to the current situation with part 3 of the Engineering Contagion series. Again, I recommend everybody go read that. Seek out some of the other interviews on this, since it's a lot of information, and if it does turn into a book, it's going to be, I think, 100 pages of footnotes, because it's all extremely well researched. None of this is theory, it's fact. I mean, some of the things we find interesting, maybe some suggestions in here and there, but it's all documented. And now for the bonus question. And this is a big question. So really, I'm just looking for your big picture thoughts on what's going on right now. Based on what you've learned from your years of research and on the powers that be in this country and in the world about their policies and agendas, can you take that and apply it to the current pandemic situation and possibly to the Black Lives Matter protests that followed? I would actually include the series of crises that we've seen play out one after the other since the 2016 election. And if you would, give us your thoughts about whether you think that there are forces powerful enough to spark these kinds of crises and exploit them to advance their agendas. And if that's possible, is that what's happening right now? Lastly, if this is part of an agenda, that would be one hell of a project on a massive scale, and it's hard to see how anyone could take on something that big and or to succeed at it. The answer to the bonus question is in an extra bonus segment for patrons. So you can find that at Patreon. You can find it on the website aroundtheempire.com. It's episode 170 extra. So I'm not great at marketing. It's not my forte, but I'm starting to provide more bonus material for patrons, as is necessary for independent media like this, funded solely by listeners, because I appreciate them and they make it possible to pay the overhead costs of the show and to compensate a little bit for the labor that goes into it. So that's my tease, and I hope that some of you will subscribe to the podcast to get these kinds of extras. There are also full episodes for patrons only, and in July there'll be a new Discord channel and hopefully soon some live streams for patrons only, where we can discuss things among ourselves. So episode 170 extra, which you can find at aroundtheempire.com and at patreon.com/aroundtheempire. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap up. Thank you so much, Whitney. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up? And also, please tell us how to find your work and how to support your work.
Well, the only thing I'd like to say about wrapping up, I sort of touched on it earlier, is that a lot of these policies that have been put forth because of coronavirus, they were planned in advance, right? They're just moving the justifications to whatever people are honestly most afraid of. And in recent months, it's been coronavirus, and that's been very successful. And they've really used this as a 9/11 style crisis to their advantage in a lot of ways in order to really reshape a lot of things and make a lot of money, which is really unfortunate. And I think it's really important for people to try and look at a lot of these policies that way, because you'll end up seeing that, hey, they're not using contact tracing, like as that example, they're not using contact tracing just for coronavirus, they're using it for protesters now. That's weird. But if you look at it as, this is something, a tool or a policy that they've wanted to implement for some time, they'll tell you, they'll sell you any reason for it, but they have their motives, their other motives about why they really want it, right? That they won't tell you.
Yeah,
so it's important to, look at the actions, but not at the words to an extent.
Right. And the shaping and the larger agenda is the tougher thing to understand. You have to draw conclusions from tons of research you've done in the past or things you've experienced. And actually we'll touch on that a little bit more in the bonus question. But yeah, it's a really key, important part of this. And none of us have a crystal ball, but some of us have been to this rodeo before in one form or another, and strongly suspect that there's a lot more to it, and there are agendas. So, Whitney, you have changed the website that you publish on, and you have a new podcast. So let's make sure everybody knows where to find all that.
Okay, well, I'm currently publishing at thelastamericanvagabond.com. I also have my own website called unlimitedhangout.com that I repost some of my articles there as well. But I'm currently working on a book on my Epstein series. So I'm not going to be writing a ton of articles between then and now, but I should have that done in wrap it up in another month or two, and then I'll be back to normal.
Excellent. And your podcast, Unlimited Hangout, as well.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's also on that website. Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I really, really appreciate it. It's always great to talk with you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Whitney Webb. Follow Whitney on Twitter @_Whitney Webb. Subscribe to her podcast, Unlimited Hangout, and find her work at her website, Unlimited Hangout, and also at The Last American Vagabond. Around the Empire podcasts, independent media, and your support's really important. Please pitch in, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. The audio podcast can be found in many places, lots of ways to listen to it, any mobile podcast app, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.